Hi guys, so as I've mentioned in my earlier video, being out of action with my right hand for the next few weeks or potentially months has made me contemplate a lot of things about swordsmanship with the left hand. Okay, during my 16 years of HEMA and before that sport fencing and a little bit of Kung Fu, it's been very evident to me, as I'm sure it's very evident to lots of you and lots of other people in martial arts, that left-handers can have a very real advantage in martial arts, and particularly in armed martial arts perhaps, because of course left-handers are usually the minority. Okay, so left-handers therefore are used to fighting right-handers, but right-handers are not necessarily used to fighting left-handers. Now, to many of you this will be old news, nothing new, no great revelations there. But it is a significant factor, and it is interesting to note that when you look at modern sport fencing, for example, there is a disproportionately high number of left-handers at the very top levels. And, you know, some people argue that maybe there's slightly quicker reaction times in left-handers because of the way that the body's put together. I know nothing about that, so feel free to comment either positively or negatively on that point. I don't really know, I don't know enough about biology to comment, and in fact I don't know if anybody really does. But from my point of view, the basic, biggest factor to why left-handers tend to have a slight advantage is that they're used to fighting right-handers and left-handers, whereas right-handers tend to be more used to just fighting right-handers. And an interesting perhaps analogy to this that I've experienced is I once entered a longsword competition. It was actually a medieval mixed weapons competition, and I used sword and buckler. Not because I was good with sword and buckler, but because my opponent I knew was very, very good with longsword, and I thought would probably beat me quite quickly with longsword. So I thought, well, what the hell, I've been doing some sword and buckler, so I'll enter with sword and buckler. And, you know, I kind of held my own, and we actually ended up doubling out, so essentially it was a draw. Whereas I think if I'd gone in with longsword, he would have beaten me pretty quickly. So again, it's the same kind of principle that if you do something, or use weapons, or fight in a way that the opponent is unused to, you can gain an advantage from that. You might not win, but you might not lose so quickly. So there are some other things to say about left-handers and swordsmanship in particular. The first thing to say is that, and this has been asked in the comments section on one of my earlier videos, I can't remember which one, about left-handed swordsmen and left-handed fencers in historical periods, and whether, you know, whether they existed, whether people were discouraged from being left-handed, and so on. Now, this is a difficult question to answer because there isn't a lot written about left-handers in historical periods in general. And, you know, a lot of people, they know that their parents or grandparents, these kind of 2 or 3 generations back, at school were encouraged to be right-handed rather than left-handed. So, for example, I know that one of my, I can't remember, I think something like a great aunt or something like that was left-handed, and she was forced pretty much at school to be right-handed, to write with her right hand and do everything with her right hand. I'm not actually sure that this is something that goes back very far. I think it may have been a product of the schooling system of the 20th century, of the first half of the 20th century, perhaps the 19th century as well. But actually, if you look at the medieval period, there are people being described as left-handed with no particular stigma attached. And as far as I know, the earliest fencing treatise to talk about left-handed fencers is Antonio Manciolino, a Bolognese master who wrote a treatise in 1531. He actually talks about how to fight against left-handers, and if I remember correctly, he also talks about advice for the left-hander to fight the right-hander as well. So 1531, left-handed fencers were being talked about in neither positive nor negative terms, just as a matter of fact thing. So left-handed fencers have clearly been around for a long time. Yes, we do see people holding their swords in their left hands in historical artwork, but then you've always got the question of whether that was intentional or just an artistic, you know, convention because they wanted the sword artistically to be shown on one side or the other for the balance of the art or whatever. But left-handed fencers were definitely around. I don't think largely, as far as I've seen, there's any evidence to suggest that left-handed fencers were necessarily discouraged from being left-handed up until, shall we say, the 19th century, and even then I'm not sure. And there are 19th century sources which also talk about left-handed fencers. One area where left-handers seem perhaps to have been discouraged is in the design of swords in the military period, in the kind of regulation military period of the late 18th century and through the 19th century and into the early 20th century. For the very simple fact that swords were generally of a regulation design, so if you were in a certain regiment you had to carry a certain style of sword to match the rest of your regiment, if you were in a cavalry regiment or if you were an officer of an infantry regiment, for example. And these swords tend to be designed in such a way that they're asymmetrical. Not always the case, particularly cavalry swords are, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century, and in fact the Napoleonic period, a lot of cavalry hilts are symmetrical. But equally, lots of other swords are asymmetrical, and if we take this British 1821 pattern sword, you can see that the guard is very much wider on the right hand side than on the left hand side, and this is for the simple fact that when you're holding it, most of the meat of your hand is on the right hand side and only your thumb really would be on the left hand side if you're a right handed person. However, if I'm a left handed fencer, you'll see that that grip now leaves a little bit of my left hand exposed on this side and protects my thumb more than it needs to. So, are there left-handed adaptations of this? Are there left-handed swords made in the 19th century? The answer is yes. And in fact there are left-handed swords going back to the Renaissance. Obviously in the medieval period swords are largely symmetrical. A medieval sword, you know, with a simple cross hilt, you can hold in either hand and it makes no difference, but in the Renaissance you start to get asymmetrical hilts which have a different balance of rings or bars on each side of the hilt to protect the shape of the hand. And you do find left-handed examples from the, basically the earliest period, from the 16th century or late 15th century all the way through. And yes, military swords you do occasionally, they're very rare, but you do occasionally find left-handed models. So sometimes, for example, you'll find a sword like this where the bars actually project more on this side and the thumb guard, as it were, projects on the other side. And I have seen an example of these made where it was almost like a homemade adaptation where they'd got a regulation sword and what they'd done is they'd dismounted the hilt and they had turned this part of the hilt, they had had someone hammer it around the other way, so essentially making a mirror image of itself, and then remount it back together. And that's a very simple way, relatively simple way, of making this guard for a left-hander to project on the left-hand side as you're holding it like that, rather than the right-hand side. Equally, you also see custom hilts like this, where the bars project more on one side, and instead of the small projection on the side where your thumb would be, if you were right-handed, they actually make the guard symmetrical. So you have two bars, for example, on this type of hilt, two bars on the outside, and I've seen an antique example of this as well. And perhaps that was for a left-hander, it would certainly work for a left-hander, or perhaps the person just wanted a symmetrical guard in that case. So yes, you do get left-handed hilts, although they are very rare. There we go, thank you.